So, ladies and gentlemen, just calling the meeting to order. My name is Robert Madlin, and as some of you know, I have the pleasure and the privilege to chair FIPA International in this town, but my primary role today is simply to introduce a stellar lineup of speakers. This is the second edition of Atomium's Research Summit series. Some of you will remember the Next Generation Internet, which was the first event. And today the theme we've chosen is towards a good AI society. How can artificial intelligence be geared in European society to do good, and how can we then contribute those insights to the world? And what better person to kick off our event than Mr. Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of my own country, sir, but also now a thinker on these issues of international governance.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and participate in the meeting. And you know, I always, when I talk about technology and its place in the world, I always start with a disclaimer, because my children say to me that I shouldn't talk about technology in public since they have a large accumulated evidence that I don't truly understand it. But with that qualification, let me make some remarks about the political importance and then how I think the debate could go in Europe and elsewhere. I mean, first of all, when we look at AI, this is a revolution. It's going to change so much of what we think about and do. I think the political importance of technology is huge, but I think there is a vast gulf between what I call the change makers and the policy makers. In other words, I think that for politicians trying to create the right public policy today, there is a gap between their understanding of the implications of this technology revolution and the understanding and, of course, practice of those who are engaged in that revolution itself. And one of the things that I think is vital is to get a better and much more structured debate between change makers and policy makers. And obviously, today's meeting is one way of doing that. I think, secondly, I would almost put it as strongly as this: when we look at the forces of populism that are distorting our politics, both from far left and far right today, I think grasping what the technological revolution means, making sense of it for people, turning it into what I would call a story that allows people to be optimistic about technology, is a big challenge and is the most important political challenge. Because if it has all these implications for the way that we live and work and think, then it should be part of the political debate to a much greater degree than actually it is. When I was in office and left office, you had health policy and education policy and energy policy, and then at the end of the line would come technology policy. And the change that's come about today is that it really covers everything. There's not a single area of policy or government that shouldn't be changed as a result of the implications of what will happen, not just in AI, but particularly in AI. And so the question is, how do you identify the opportunities, analyze the risks, and prepare for what is going to be a different way of living, working, and thinking? In respect of the good side of it, you know, the title of the seminar is, AI good. The benefits of AI are allowing us to personalize, obviously, to monitor services, to be able to classify data and therefore act on it in a more intelligent way, prediction, modeling, research, If we take the area of healthcare, for example, it should be able to give us ways that we can do real-time monitoring of conditions. It should allow us much better and more accurate diagnosis. You know, I am engaged in something called the International Cancer Initiative at the moment. The fact is, one of the single most important ways of being able to develop better treatments and indeed cures for cancer is to have the data shared and organized in a much larger way. So in healthcare, welfare, where we can get much more accurate, much faster ways of dealing with the complex interactions between citizens and the benefit system. In energy, which allow us to make massive savings, but also personalizing education, revolutionizing transport, crisis management, even law and order. In all of these areas, there is the opportunity to produce a much better government service and a much better way of allowing the citizen to have more control over their own lives and their interaction with the state. And then, of course, for business, it's going, again, to be revolutionary. Most countries today are engaged in digitalization strategies, but really government, again, is going to have to be prepared for what will be a significant change in the jobs market and the position of people objectively in the workplace as a result of AI and automation, big data. Now, the estimates vary as to how great the change is going to be, but let's assume it's going to be even 15, 20%, and some estimates put it much higher. But even with that, it's going to cause significant disruption. There may well be other jobs created as a result, but it's going to require a focus and an attention and a different partnership with business and the private sector from anything that we've seen before. And then, of course, you've got all the issues around privacy, the misuse of data, questions of built-in bias or prejudice in the way that AI is used. So for all these reasons, it's important to get the policy right, and this policy debate should be a big part of any serious agenda, whether at the national or European level. But I think the most important thing is to approach this from the point of view of technology being something that offers us opportunity, though we have to mitigate its challenges and its risks, rather than seeing it as a threat, which if at all possible we must resist. And as I've said to many of my colleagues in politics, both in America and this side of the water, there is a risk, I think, in today's new political environment that technology gets caught up in a populist wave of demagoguery that says, look, this technology is going to cost you your job, it's going to change the way that you live, and it's something that we should resist. I think it's vitally important that we're explaining to people, no, this is something that can yield enormous benefits, but of course, because like any revolution, it has sometimes intended, sometimes unintended consequences, we have to prepare for it. And that's why it's important to draw up an agenda that has at its heart an intelligent dialogue between change makers and policy makers, where government is trying to maximize the opportunities that this provides, business is preparing and government is assisting in this, and we have an active government trying to create the right form of regulation and also the right instruments of education and reskilling that people are going to need as a result of the consequences of this. Now, then when we come to where does Europe stand in all of this, I think it's pretty clear again what the challenges are. So the US and China are, in a very powerful position in the development of this technology. We are, to be fair, we are in a much better position in Europe than we were a few years back. But I think the gap is still quite large. I was looking at some of the figures, and though it's true, for example, we would have roughly at 70 unicorns in the EU, unicorn companies in 2017, 2018. That's double what it was a few years back. But, you compare for the size of our economy, if you take the numbers of companies created since the year 2000 and you take their value, the gap between Europe, China, America is still large. Okay. And if you look, for example, at the amount of money that these can be raised through venture capital in the US, it's still roughly 5 times the amount in Europe. If you look at how many companies have a market value of $100 billion or more in the technology sphere, I think there's one, which is SAP here in Europe, probably one, yeah. Whereas obviously in America there are many. So, we've got a situation where we've got a lot to catch up on. Now, Europe has been catching up. The creation of the EU single digital market is important. GDPR, I think, showed a European attitude to innovate around regulation. Now, you can debate aspects of it, but it's interesting that it is taken up in many quarters now in the US as a potential model. I would like to suggest that one of the most important things that could happen is that the European Union and the United States create, if you like, almost like a new transatlantic alliance for cooperation in regulation. Because one thing that I think will become very clear is China is going to move ahead with this, as we know, in a very aggressive way. It's going to do so, frankly, free of the constraints that we place for perfectly good reasons here in Europe on the way that we operate. And, if we want to make sure that as these technologies develop and change our world, the types of values that we believe in run through the process of regulating technology, I think it's important that that cooperation is there. If you think about it, if what I'm saying is right about the importance of this technological change, it's almost like, if you see it in geopolitical terms, it's as important as any aspect of defense or industrial capability. So if we're not able to ensure that we produce the next wave of technological revolution and anchor it here, then we're going to find ourselves in a situation where China will pursue its aims very aggressively. Fine, that's up to them, they can do that. But I think it's going to be very important for us to recognize that the Europeans and Americans, because of the link of values between the two sides of the Atlantic, and leave aside the temporary political challenges, let's say, at the moment, but the values, the alliance around values is important enough to make sure that Europe and America should stay in step together. Now, it's actually a pleasure to be able to at least start a presentation without talking about Brexit, but but I'm afraid I have to, at least in passing, to say this simply. I mean, I still hope and believe that it's possible for us to avoid Brexit, and I and many others like me will continue working until the midnight hour to stop it, since I think it is a terrible mistake for my country and indeed for Europe. But whether it happens or not, given also Britain's position in the technology sector, not least in machine learning and deep learning, it's important whatever happens that we keep the cooperation strong. And I think it's very hard to see how it's rational for Britain, even after Brexit, to go outside of the orbit of the European digital single market regulatory system. I would have thought it's much more rational for us to want to be part of that. But that's going to take working on if we indeed go ahead with Brexit. And I think, given the position of Britain in the technology space, I think to make sure that we keep that that cooperation strong and find new ways of working together will be very important. But I hope that's, for me, very much the second best rather than stopping it altogether. So to conclude, I think right now, the most urgent thing is to get the structured debate and dialogue between those in the technology sphere who are changing the world and those charged with public policy, so that we get the right policy to improve the climate for technological development, because we want our companies to grow more strongly and we want to have greater weight in the economic and business sphere. It is to make sure that we have regulation that is smart and capable of protecting our values, protecting the interests of the citizen, but doing so in a way that does not inhibit our first priority, which is the development of that technology. And thirdly, to make sure that we are in dialogue with the United States, because I think how Europe and America develop together will be important because of the rise of Chinese power in this area. And I say that, by the way, I hope very much that China, and believe that it will develop in a benign way. I just think we've got to be ready for every eventuality. And the conclusion, therefore, is that what we're trying to do in this space today is probably the single most important challenge that we face. And for those here who are from the political part, we have got to find a way of arousing and exciting the interest of our people to focus on these questions, because they are the things that are really going to make the difference. And at the moment, our politics is kind of caught between, one group of people on the right who want to emphasize immigration as the biggest issue. Well, we know there are problems that need to be dealt with there and we should deal with them. But frankly, that is not what is going to decide the future. Other people want to take us back on the further left to a politics of the past that targets business almost as the problem. The risk with both of those groups is that they see technology as an enemy and not as a solution. And therefore, what we're trying to do here has got fundamental importance, not just in a technical sense as to how this technological revolution develops. It's got enormous importance in a deep, profound political sense as to how the next 10, 20 years develops in Europe. And therefore, what I would like to see is this issue and its importance take center stage in the political debate. And I think that is the big challenge that we have. And it's no doubt why we have this seminar today. And I wanted to come just to say to you, from our perspective, this is a hugely important issue, and we want to play our full part in developing it with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Tony. And just as Eva Kaili is leaving, I wanted to thank her for hosting us in the Parliament. Eva, I know you'll be back tomorrow for the closing plenary. Mr. Blair has kindly agreed to take a couple of questions because he has to leave before the close of this first panel session. So are there questions from the floor? Please, remember to say who you are. So press the red button and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Patrizia Antonini with ANSA Press Agency. I would like you to develop a little bit more this idea of this alliance, EU alliance and the US versus China. And I was kind of struck by what you said, the benign development of China and the need to be ready for every scenario. So if you could elaborate on this a little bit. And a second question as well on Brexit. I know it's not your favorite scenario to have Brexit, but what do you think about the idea about the draft that is taking pattern lately in order to find a deal with the EU? Thank you.
Maybe if you allow, we ask Eva also to pose her question.
Yeah, sure.
And then you get to answer everything together. Eva?
Thank you so much, and congratulations to you for organizing this event, and Michelangelo. It's amazing because you started working before it became a priority also in the European Parliament, this subject. We understand how rapidly everything changes. We live in a transforming world. I agree with your analysis that it's not actually migration, it's the fear and the perception that people have from their lives that are changing, and everything we believe it's happening outside our door. So the reason I'm leaving is because we have a workshop trying to find ways to respond to that. So not the fake news. You don't need fake news, you can just get very good news and force people to seek constantly scenes of fear and try to make them believe that everything is too specific news and nothing else exists, no positive news exists. So it's the perception, trying to manipulate the news feed, believing that personalized news feed creates like this perception that nothing good is going on and that migration is approaching very fast and AI is taking our jobs. So basically AI and how the newsfeed is changing can create this different perspective of what the real world is. So we have to respond to that. It's not easy because the first reaction we had here in the Parliament was to ban content, which would be actually worse than trying to fix things and make sure that people will have different options. And the political parties, they are really close to become irrelevant to the new challenges. And that's why we are constantly surprised by the results. I don't know if you have something more specific on that, but it would really take a lot of time and understanding and open minds to change how the traditional parties try to face these challenges.
So 3 big questions.
Yeah, they are. So, first of all, on EU and US, when you look at the development of AI, it's going to raise a whole series of questions that aren't just technical, but they're also about issues to do with citizens' rights and values and so on. And let's be clear, China is not going to have the same elements of thinking that we will have in respect of this. And they've set a very strong ambition, and they intend to meet that ambition. Now, they still have a lot of challenges to overcome. But for Europe and America, this is an area where in regulatory terms, however our companies may compete, in regulatory terms, it actually makes sense to keep in step as much as possible and to try and work out answers to some of these delicate values questions, to try and work out answers that we have in common. Because then you will create, frankly, a more enabling environment for our companies, and we will be in a situation where people can see that this technology and its changes is not just happening, but there is a real and concerted effort to make sure it happens in a way that protects people, and offers them the opportunities that they want. So to me, it makes perfect sense, given the changing geopolitics of the world and the importance of this, to make sure that we do everything we can to maintain our position. And we've got an interest in that in Europe, and the Americans have got an interest in that. And it really is in neither's interest to have two competing regulatory systems that then make it harder for our companies to operate, and make our citizens, in a sense, more distrustful of the way that this technology develops, because the key to the regulation will be to make sure that people feel that they can trust it. Now, this is not going to be the same undertaking or test that will be applied by China. So I think, that's what I'm saying. A transatlantic alliance on technological regulation would make a lot of sense to me if we can reach the right way of doing that. Now, on Brexit, it's very simple with Brexit, and I'm not saying anything here that I don't say all the time in the UK. There are two types of Brexit you can have. You can have a Brexit where, for economic reasons, we keep in step with Europe's rules, and actually the digital single market's a classic example of that. But if we leave Europe and keep in step with Europe's rules, we end up with what I call a pointless Brexit. I mean, if the whole purpose, it's not my belief, but if the whole purpose is to escape these rules, it's a weird way of taking back control. If you leave Europe and then still abide by those rules, then you've just lost your say over them. Okay, so that's pointless Brexit. On the other hand, if you decide to break free, given all the interrelationships and commercial and trading ties that have grown up over these past 4 decades, if you cut all those, then that's going to be very painful. So that's your painful Brexit. So you've got a pointless Brexit or a painful Brexit. Now, I think the alternative people will try and come up with in the next few weeks is a postponed Brexit. In other words, because you don't want to make the choice between pointless and painful, because neither's a good choice, what we call in English fudge it, so that we go the other side of March 2019, we leave, and then we try and resolve these issues. So this is a huge mistake for us and for you. If we go the other side of March 2019 and we haven't resolved these issues, then all that will happen is that the battle will continue and the uncertainty will continue. So my view is, make the choice now, pointless or painful, and if it's neither of those two things, then we should have the sense to vote down this deal and go back to the people and ask them how they want to proceed. So that is the scenario that we are working for, and let us see what happens. I mean, I think how we deal with people's fears over technology. So all of this, it's the same with immigration, by the way. All of it is an anxiety that in a fast-changing world, people think they've lost control. That's really at the heart of all of the populist surge, right and left. So what we've got to show people is there are intelligent ways of keeping control, but also taking advantage of the changes that are happening in the world. Because, for example, most people, when you ask them, will say, okay, I agree, immigration can be good for our country. But they'll worry that uncontrolled immigration means that no one decides, there's no rules, there's no order in it. And our job, I think, politically, is to say, no, we respond to the concerns about the absence of rules and order and structure. There should be those rules, but we want rules and not prejudices, because the prejudices actually inhibit our economic development. So if you take Britain, or actually in the technology sphere, in any of our countries, how great a role do immigrants play in the development of those technological capabilities? Massive. You know, Silicon Valley without immigration would not be Silicon Valley, and the same for the UK tech sector, and I guess it's the same everywhere in Europe. So we need to better deal with the people's fears. Likewise on technology, it's explaining to people, this is why it's so important people understand, this technology can deliver huge benefits to us in areas like healthcare and welfare and energy and so on. And then we say to them, yes, it will have a displacement impact, but we can prepare for that. So it's all about showing people that there's a way they can make the change work for them. Because that's what they fear. They fear they're losing control of their lives, and no one is standing up for them as this change happens around them. And that's why when a demagogue comes along and says, I'm going to take care of it by stopping the immigrants, or I'm going to take care of it by taking over business, that's how they manage to succeed. And that's why what we've got to do is say, there's a way of meeting your fears, right, and opening the opportunities. And by the way, it will, just finally on this point, it will mean a change in the way government works. And one of the things I would do if I was back in office today is I would be changing the structure of government radically to deal with these issues. Because government as it's presently organized is not good. You know, any of us know about government. The problem with government is always the same. It's great at managing a system, it's not so good at changing a system. And, you know, I always say to people, if Clement Attlee, who was the Labour Prime Minister after the Second World War, came back to Britain today and he walked the streets, he would be absolutely astonished at all the changes that were happening until he went back into the seat of government, and then he'd feel completely at home. So, you know, it's also going to mean big change in government, but that's the agenda. And one of the things that is going to defeat this populism, it will ultimately be defeated when we switch the conversation. When we say to people, we've taken account of your concerns, now here is the agenda we need to focus on for the future.
Thank you very much.